White cops framed a black woman, bribed a judge, but they never expected who she really was. Ebony Mitchell never imagined a routine drive home would change her life forever. A dedicated community advocate, she had spent the evening mentoring at-risk youth, only to find herself staring at flashing police lights in her rearview mirror. What started as a simple traffic stop spiraled into a nightmare. Accused of a crime she didn't commit, framed by corrupt officers, and thrown into a legal battle designed to break her, Ebony was fighting against a system that had already decided her fate. The cops had planted evidence. The judge had been bribed. Every move seemed rigged against her. But what they didn't know, Ebony wasn't just another victim. She was someone they never should have underestimated. Stay with me, because this story will expose just how deep corruption can go, and what happens when the wrong woman is pushed too far. Ebony Mitchell glanced at the digital clock on her car's dashboard. It glowed 11:47 p.m. in bright green numerals. She was on her way back from a long day at the community center in Oakwood, a fictional small city in the south of Charleston County, South Carolina, where she volunteered 3 nights a week. The route home was dark and winding, lined with old trees that curved like eerie fingers over the narrow road. It was a path she knew by heart. She'd grown up around these parts, had walked these very roads as a teenager, returning from choir practice, a backpack slung over her shoulders as she made her way through night after night, dreaming big about her future. That was a decade ago. Now Ebony was 28, with a master's degree in community administration and a drive to uplift every neglected corner of her hometown. Her heart was heavy that night, for she'd just finished consoling another family who'd lost a loved one to a spiral of addiction. But as she stared ahead at the long stretch of asphalt, she tried to reassure herself. She would keep fighting. That was her nature. It happened so suddenly. A flash of headlights came up behind her, glaring in her rearview mirror. Then blue and red lights swirled into a frantic dance of color. Sirens tore through the silence, and Ebony felt her heart begin to race. This was not the first time she'd been pulled over. In Oakwood, cops had a habit of picking on people who didn't belong in certain neighborhoods after dark, even though Ebony had lived in the same 2-bedroom cottage for years. She slowed down, put on her turn signal, and carefully pulled to the side of the road. Her hands trembled. She took a breath, telling herself she'd done nothing wrong. All her registration and insurance were up to date. There was no reason for her to fear. Yet the fear settled in anyway, creeping along her spine like a cold, merciless snake. Ebony rolled down her window, hearing the crunch of gravel as 2 officers approached. She flicked on the overhead interior light and placed her trembling hands on the steering wheel, praying this would be just a routine check. Her eyes caught the reflection of the officers in the side mirror, and she noticed their posture. Rigid, aggressive. One had a flashlight, shining it across her back seat with no courtesy or greeting. "License and registration," the taller officer barked, shining his flashlight directly into her eyes. His nameplate read, "Officer T. Bigby." She held back a sigh. "Yes, officer," she said calmly, retrieving her wallet. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" His partner, a stocky man with a grim smile and the name Hatfield on his uniform, gave her a once-over. "Speeding," he said, even though Ebony was sure she'd stuck meticulously to the speed limit. "And your taillight's out." A swift pang of worry seized her. She'd had her car inspected just a month ago. The taillights were fine earlier that evening, but she knew it was useless to argue. She handed over her license and registration. Officer Bigby walked back to the patrol car while Hatfield remained close by, shining his beam of light directly onto Ebony's face. Long minutes trickled past. She could see Bigby messing around in his cruiser, probably checking her records. Ebony tried to stay calm. She'd done nothing wrong. All they'd find was a squeaky clean record. No tickets, no arrests, no shady history. Eventually, Bigby returned. Ebony noticed an odd expression flickering across his face, anticipation mixed with cruelty. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Ebony's heart thumped hard in her chest. "Why? What's the problem?" she asked, keeping her voice as level as possible. "Step out of the vehicle," Bigby repeated more firmly. His hand hovered near his holster. She didn't want to give them any reason to escalate. With shaky hands, Ebony unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. She stepped out into the sticky summer night, her legs unsteady on the grass beside the road. The moon hung overhead, illuminating her fear for anyone to see, if only there was anyone around to witness. Bigby turned his flashlight on her trunk. "Pop it open," he ordered, throwing a quick glance at Hatfield. Ebony stiffened. "Officer, I don't consent to a search." But Hatfield already snatched the keys from her grip. "Open it," he repeated, ignoring her protest. "Unless you got something to hide." Her chest felt tight. "I haven't done anything wrong," she insisted. "You have no probable cause." "Probable cause?" Bigby mocked her. "Look at you. You're the one out here this late, driving suspiciously and with a busted taillight." Hatfield pushed the key into the trunk. His broad back blocked Ebony's view. She heard rustling, rummaging. Then, as if on cue, a triumphant laugh rang out. Hatfield turned, brandishing a small zip-locked bag. "Well, would you look at this?" he said. The bag contained a white powder Ebony immediately recognized as either cocaine or heroin. She felt her stomach drop. "That's not mine!" Ebony shouted. The panic in her voice was raw. "You planted that!" "I've never touched anything like that in my life." Her eyes darted between the two officers, both looking unbearably smug. She realized in that moment that this was far from a random stop. This was a setup. Whether it was racially motivated or something else, Ebony understood she was being cornered. Her mind spun. Did she know too much about the corruption in Oakwood? Had she angered someone at City Hall with her endless campaigning for social justice? Officer Bigby grabbed her arm with iron force, swinging her around to cuff her wrists. "Ebony Mitchell," he said, reading from her license with cold finality. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." And just like that, Ebony felt her world tilt upside down. They took her to the Oakwood police station, a squat grey concrete building that looked as bleak as Ebony felt inside. The booking process was a blur. Fingerprints, photographs, the humiliating pat-downs. She tried to ask for a lawyer, but the officers ignored her demands, continuing the fiasco as if she was nothing but a piece of cargo. Several hours later, Ebony found herself in a holding cell. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed with white noise, intensifying her throbbing headache. She sat on a cold bench, hugging her arms to her chest. The rank smell of sweat and bleach filled her nostrils. She tried to hold on to reason, forcing her mind to think logically. She needed to get out of here, needed to call her lawyer. Tasha, her best friend from high school, was now a practicing defense attorney in Charleston. Tasha would know exactly what to do, but nobody came. Time blurred. Her watch and phone had been confiscated. She could only guess it was near dawn when an officer approached, a scowl plastered across his face. "Mitchell, you made bail," he said. "Let's go." Relief flared in Ebony, though confusion followed close behind. She hadn't been allowed a phone call. Who posted bail? She stood slowly, feeling the stiff ache in her muscles. The officer shoved a plastic bag of her personal items at her. Then, with an impatient nod, he led her to the station's exit. Ebony squinted at the morning sun stabbing her eyes. It must have been around 7 a.m. Leaning against a battered old sedan was her friend Tasha Cole, arms folded. The tension in her stance eased slightly when she saw Ebony. "Oh, thank God," Tasha said, rushing forward to envelop Ebony in a hug. Ebony nearly collapsed in her friend's embrace, relief welling in her eyes. How did you know?" Ebony managed, stepping back to look Tasha over. Tasha's professional persona was in full swing, hair in a tight bun, business suit perfectly pressed. "Your mother called me when you didn't come home. Then I started calling around. Finally found out they had you here on a possession charge." Tasha's gaze hardened. "I called in favors and reached out to the local NLOACP branch to get you bail as fast as possible. We'll fight this, Ebony, I promise." Ebony took a trembling breath. "They planted it," she said, voice quivering with anger. "Those cops, Bigby and Hatfield, they pulled me over, forced open my trunk, then just magically found a bag of drugs. Tasha's lips thinned into a resolute line. We'll prove it. Let's get you out of here. You need some rest and a shower. Ebony nodded. Her body felt numb as she sank into the passenger seat of Tasha's car. The sun rose higher, revealing a hazy summertime sky. On another day, it might have been beautiful. But Ebony's insides were churning. She was innocent, yet she was about to be dragged through the mud. And from the predatory glint she'd seen in the officer's eyes, it felt like the setup went beyond just them. Ebony suspected a system-wide corruption that stretched to every corner of Oakwood. She was determined to uncover it, even if it meant gambling with her own freedom. Over the next few days, Ebony found herself in a surreal nightmare. Tasha worked tirelessly, filing motions, requesting body cam footage, and gathering Ebony's community references. They both hoped the truth would emerge quickly, some glitch in the camera, or proof that the tail light had been tampered with. But the Oakwood Police Department was suspiciously uncooperative. Requests for the officer's body cam footage were met with red tape. Ebony's car, which might hold evidence of tampering, was locked away in an impound lot. Even Tasha had difficulty getting access to it. The situation worsened when Ebony received notice of her court date. Just a week away. Her stomach sank further when she read who would preside over her case, Judge Conrad Wheeler. Ebony recognized the name. Wheeler had a reputation for being tough on drug offenders. Some said he was fair. Others claimed he handed down near-maximum sentences for even minor possession charges. Ebony tried not to let fear swallow her whole. She had never had any run-ins with the law, so on the surface it should be an open and shut case of an unlawful arrest. But Ebony knew Oakwood's history of covering for its own. She braced herself for the worst. Meanwhile, Tasha dug into the backgrounds of Officers Bigby and Hatfield. What she found was a string of vaguely similar arrests, young black residents who insisted they'd been targeted and framed. But each of those cases mysteriously vanished, either with plea deals or suspicious recantations from the defendants. Something stinks, Tasha said one evening in Ebony's living room, scanning through old records on her laptop. The rate of drug possession arrests by Bigby and Hatfield is abnormally high. They always claim the suspect gave them probable cause, and yet every single request for body cam footage was either inconclusive or got lost. Ebony nodded grimly. They've done this before. The question is why. And who's letting them get away with it? Tasha added. The two women exchanged a look. Ebony's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Another outpouring of support from a neighbor who'd heard about her arrest. Dozens of people she'd helped over the years were calling and messaging, furious that Ebony could be accused of such a thing. But Ebony also saw the worry in their eyes when they spoke to her in person. They believed her, but they feared the power of the police, feared retribution if they spoke up. We'll keep digging, Tasha said, and we'll call in bigger guns if we need to. Ebony nodded. But as she turned her gaze toward the darkening window, she was haunted by an uncomfortable suspicion. They were up against more than just two dirty cops. There was a reason they had targeted her, and if Judge Wheeler was part of it, there could be an entire apparatus designed to silence people like her. The day of Ebony's hearing arrived under a slate-gray sky. Thunder rumbled in the distance, mirroring the tension in her gut. Tasha met Ebony on the courthouse steps. The building was a grand neoclassical structure, overshadowing the smaller municipal offices around it. Ebony had walked by it many times as a child, always feeling a solemn sense of respect for the law. Now those marble columns felt foreboding, as if they hid a labyrinth of injustice inside. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Ebony's stomach twisted at the sight of Officers Bigby and Hatfield. They stood in crisp uniforms, flanked by other officers who patted their shoulders in silent solidarity. Their eyes met Ebony's with smug defiance. She looked away, a wave of nausea hitting her. Did they really think they'd get away with this? Judge Conrad Wheeler arrived, robe swirling around him as he stepped onto the bench. He was tall, in his mid-50s, with a pronounced jawline that gave him a perpetual air of disapproval. He peered down over his half-rimmed glasses at Ebony. What followed felt like a carefully orchestrated performance. The prosecutor droned on about Ebony's alleged intent to distribute, citing the bag of powder found in her trunk and the incriminating behavior she'd shown. Tasha tried to argue Ebony's impeccable community record, pointing out the suspicious nature of the search. But Wheeler cut Tasha off repeatedly, sustaining every objection the prosecutor raised. Then came the shock. Wheeler denied Tasha's request to see the body cam footage, claiming the footage was lost due to a malfunction with the cameras that night. Tasha nearly exploded. "Your Honor, this is a critical piece of evidence. The entire case hinges on that footage." "I said it's unavailable," Wheeler snapped, refusing to meet her eyes. "We'll proceed with what we have." When Tasha tried to reference Bigby and Hatfield's arrest history, Wheeler ruled it inadmissible, calling it prejudicial evidence. By the time the hearing concluded, Ebony felt like she'd walked into a rigged game. Wheeler refused to dismiss the charges, setting a trial date 3 weeks away. Ebony was left reeling, wondering if the judge had any intention of allowing a fair trial at all. Outside the courtroom, Ebony saw Hatfield and Bigby standing with the prosecutor near a vending machine, exchanging low chuckles. She clenched her fists. Tasha guided Ebony away before she did something rash. "We'll regroup," Tasha said quietly. "I'm not backing down." Ebony nodded, grateful for Tasha's unwavering support. But she also understood now that they were fighting a system deeply invested in convicting her. The turning point came unexpectedly. One late afternoon, a knock at Ebony's door startled her from her restless doze on the living room couch. She looked through the peephole. A woman with anxious eyes and a hood pulled low over her face stood on her porch. Ebony hesitated, but something about the woman's expression, an urgent plea, made her open the door. "Ms. Mitchell?" the stranger asked, voice hushed. "My name's Wanda Price. I think I can help you." Ebony stepped aside, letting Wanda into the modest living room. "Help me how?" Wanda glanced around, as if worried about hidden microphones. She was petite, her hands trembling nervously. I used to date Officer Bigby," she confessed, wringing her hands. "He's not a good person. I read about your case in the newspaper. The Charleston Post and Courier did a piece on your arrest. I believe you're telling the truth, that he framed you, because he's done it before." Ebony's heart pounded. "Can you prove it?" Wanda swallowed hard. "I think so. I was with Travis, Officer Bigby, for 3 years. He never hid his prejudices. He boasted about arrests. A few months ago, I found out he and Hatfield were bribing Judge Wheeler so their cases would sail through. Bigby bragged that Wheeler had a gambling debt, and Bigby claimed it gave them leverage. They'd pay him off, and Wheeler would bury evidence, rule in their favor, the whole deal." Ebony's eyes widened. This was far bigger than she'd even suspected. "Do you have any kind of documentation or—" Wanda pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and showed Ebony a series of text messages. Ebony's hands trembled as she scrolled. The messages were from Bigby's phone number, referencing payoffs, Judge Wheeler, and our best arrangement yet. Ebony read the lines over and over, her shock intensifying. Ebony nearly dropped the phone. This was the smoking gun, a direct link between corrupt officers and a corrupt judge. "Wanda, this could blow this case wide open." Wanda nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "I know, I'm scared, but it's time someone exposed them." Ebony reached out, clasped Wanda's shaking hands. "Thank you. I have a lawyer, my friend Tasha Cole. We need to show her these messages. She'll know what to do. She can protect you." Wanda gave a teary nod, relief flooding her features. "I just hope it's not too late." Little did either of them know, powerful forces were already in motion to keep this scandal hidden. The same evening that Wanda visited, Tasha was at her office, preparing a motion to compel the court for any existing camera footage. The new text message evidence could shift the entire case. She planned to share it with Ebony and then decide how best to present it to a higher court. Maybe even get the FBI involved for judicial corruption. She was staying late, well after her colleagues had gone home. The overhead lights hummed in the nearly empty law office. She had the texts pulled up on her computer screen, dissecting each reference to Judge Wheeler and the bank accounts. This was big, possibly big enough to explode Oakwood's entire law enforcement system. A sudden sense of unease crawled up Tasha's spine. She paused, listening. Footsteps in the hallway. The door to her office was slightly ajar, letting in a sliver of fluorescent light from the corridor. She stood and peeked outside. The hallway was empty. Was it just her nerves? She sat back down, trying to focus on the motion. Another noise, this time more distinct, like a soft scuffle. She turned toward the door again, heart hammering. She was about to stand up when the door flew open. 2 masked men in black barreled in. Tasha screamed, but one man clamped a hand over her mouth. The other tore the power cord from her computer, ripping it free and smashing the tower onto the floor. Her eyes were wide with terror. She flailed, trying to fight back, but the men were burly and well-trained. Before she could wrestle free, they seized the phone from her desk, yanking its wires out of the wall. Everything was a whirlwind. Tasha felt a heavy blow to her ribs, pain radiating through her side. A black-gloved hand pressed firmly over her mouth again, stifling her attempts to call for help. "You like sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," growled one of the men. He rummaged through the desk until he found a flash drive Tasha had used to back up Wanda's messages. With a vicious smirk behind his mask, he snapped it in half. Tears of rage welled in Tasha's eyes. These were no random criminals. They knew exactly what they were doing. She tried to see if there was any identifying feature, but they wore dark clothes and masks, their eyes cold and void of mercy. "Next time," one of them hissed, "you keep your mouth shut, or we'll shut it for good." With that, they slammed Tasha into the corner of her desk. Pain exploded in her shoulder, and then everything faded to black. When Tasha woke, her head pounded, and her shoulder felt dislocated. Papers and broken computer parts littered the floor. Her phone was gone, as were her digital backups of the text messages. She managed to sit up, wincing at the flare of pain. Fear and anger seethed in her gut. This was a direct attack on Ebony's defense, and more than that, it was a warning. She crawled to her purse, which had been knocked over in the scuffle. Miraculously, her personal cell phone was still inside. They must have overlooked it. Hands shaking, she dialed 911. The operator's voice was crisp and professional, though Tasha could barely string together her words. She reported the break-in, the assault, her suspicion that it was connected to a police corruption case. Officers from the Charleston Police Department arrived before Oakwood PD could. Tasha specifically asked for city officers, not trusting anyone from Oakwood. An ambulance took her to the hospital, where doctors confirmed she had a sprained shoulder, bruised ribs, and a concussion. Tasha gave her statement to the Charleston detectives, omitting no detail. She confessed her fear that Oakwood officers or their associates might be behind the attack. The Charleston detectives exchanged uneasy glances, but promised to look into it. As Tasha lay in the hospital bed, her mind churned. The men had destroyed her digital backups, but Wanda might still have the messages on her phone. Perhaps Tasha could salvage them from Ebony's phone too, since Ebony had forwarded some screenshots. They hadn't erased the truth completely. Tasha's phone buzzed. She winced, carefully reaching for it with her good arm. "Private number?" She hesitated, then answered. "Ms. Cole," said a male voice, quiet and measured. "You don't know me, but I'm an ally. I heard what happened. I can help." Tasha tensed. "Who are you?" "Someone on the inside," the voice said. "I've been collecting evidence on Wheeler, Bigby, and Hatfield for months. It's bigger than you realize. They've threatened me too, but if you're willing to fight, I can provide a trove of information, evidence you can use in court, evidence that can get the FBI involved." Tasha's mind spun. "Why should I trust you?" A pause, then a heavy sigh. "You have no reason to, but I'm the only chance you've got right now." The line crackled. "Meet me at the old Riverside factory near the county line tomorrow at midnight. Come alone. Bring Mrs. Mitchell. I'll give you what you need." Tasha bit her lip. This was risky. They could be leading her into a trap, but she had no choice. Ebony's future depended on unearthing real proof of the conspiracy. "All right," Tasha said quietly. "We'll be there." The call ended. Tasha felt her heart racing. She needed to get out of the hospital, warn Ebony, and make a plan. As terrifying as this was, she sensed it was the break they needed. Maybe their secret ally could help them expose the entire system. The next day, Ebony helped Tasha check out of the hospital. The bruises on Tasha's face and the sling on her arm made Ebony's blood boil. They sat in Ebony's cottage, blinds drawn, discussing the mysterious phone call. "This is dangerous," Ebony murmured. "They already attacked you once. They might try again." Tasha nodded, wincing at the pain. "But we can't just give up. If this person really has evidence, bank statements, recorded conversations, anything that proves Wheeler and the cops are in collusion, it could be what finally frees you, and not just you, maybe all the people they've framed over the years." Ebony stared at her friend, dread and hope swirling inside her. "Then let's do it. We'll be careful." They spent the afternoon strategizing, making sure their phones were fully charged, carrying backups of Wanda's texts on separate flash drives. Ebony still had copies of some of the messages Wanda had sent her, and she'd forwarded them to a private email as well. Tasha insisted on multiple backups. "Redundancy is our only defense right now," she said. When midnight approached, they drove to the abandoned Riverside factory, an old textile mill that had gone bankrupt decades ago. The structure loomed against the moonlit sky, windows shattered, the parking lot full of weeds. Ebony's heart pounded in her throat as they parked at the edge of the lot, headlights off. Silence enveloped them. "Do you see anyone?" Ebony whispered. Tasha shook her head. "Wait, there—" She pointed to a faint beam of light near the factory's side entrance. They left the car and approached cautiously. Ebony's footsteps crunched on broken glass. The door creaked as they pushed it open. The inside was a maze of rusted machinery and tattered office partitions. A single lantern glowed in one of the corridors. Standing beside it was a man in a hoodie, face partially in shadow. Ebony recognized him from around Oakwood, Jeremy West, a city clerk who sometimes attended public council meetings. She never suspected him to be part of this fiasco, but it made sense now that he was an insider. Tasha cleared her throat. "We're here." Jeremy nodded. He shifted the lantern, illuminating his anxious features. "I'm sorry about the cloak and dagger routine, but I had to be sure no one followed. Wheeler and those officers have eyes everywhere." "You said you have evidence," Ebony said. Jeremy nodded, pulling a small laptop from his bag. "I work in the finance department at City Hall. I started noticing odd transactions that linked Wheeler's personal accounts to multiple offshore accounts. Then I realized some of these deposits came from private accounts that were tied, indirectly, to Bigby and Hatfield. I did more digging. I found logs of cases Wheeler presided over that ended suspiciously. The final puzzle piece was seeing your name, Ebony, pop up in references to a target Bigby was going after." Tasha inhaled sharply. "So they singled Ebony out specifically?" "Yes. Ebony's been championing a local oversight committee to track police misconduct. She's close with the folks at the NAACP. That threatened the cozy arrangement Wheeler and the cops had. They decided to take her out before she could get more traction." Ebony's stomach twisted. She remembered how she'd been advocating for an independent board to review all police stops, demanding body cam footage for accountability. She hadn't realized she'd become a big enough threat to be framed so blatantly. Jeremy set the laptop on a broken table. "Here, the files are all saved locally. Bank statements, email correspondences, hidden camera footage. Yes, I got footage. Wheeler met with Bigby at a motel once, and I installed a hidden camera in the hallway. It's not perfect, but you can see them exchanging an envelope. He opened a folder, playing a grainy video. It showed Wheeler in plain clothes, Bigby handing over what looked like a thick envelope. The date stamp was just 2 weeks ago. Ebony's eyes widened. This was exactly the kind of damning proof they needed. But before they could rejoice, a noise echoed through the empty factory, a metallic clang, like a door being forced open. Tasha and Ebony froze. Jeremy turned off the lantern, plunging them into near darkness, except for the laptop's faint glow. "They've found us," Jeremy hissed, shutting the laptop's lid. A beam of flashlight cut through the corridor, landing on their small group. Ebony's heart lurched. 2 silhouettes advanced, and she recognized them instantly. Officers Bigby and Hatfield. "Well, well," Bigby sneered, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "Guess you just can't stop snooping, can you?" Hatfield's bulk filled the corridor, a menacing shape. Ebony's mind raced. They were unarmed, cornered. The cops had guns. "Stay back," Tasha snapped. "We're meeting here on private business. You have no authority to search us without a warrant." Bigby let out a harsh laugh. "You think that matters?" He aimed a flashlight right at Jeremy's face. "We know you've been poking around accounts you shouldn't. We're here to shut you all up. Permanently if we have to." Hatfield's hand hovered near his holster. "Let's just say the report will read, 'We found a group of criminals trespassing. They pulled a weapon. We responded with lethal force.'" Ebony felt panic burn in her chest. They needed to escape. But how? The cops blocked the corridor, the only exit route they knew. Jeremy swallowed. "We have copies, multiple copies, of everything," he bluffed, raising his voice. "Even if you kill us, the evidence will come out." A flicker of uncertainty passed over Bigby's face. Hatfield wavered too, scanning the darkness behind them. Ebony latched onto that moment of hesitation. She spotted a side hallway to their left, half blocked by debris. "Run," she whispered to Tasha and Jeremy. Then she grabbed a chunk of broken metal pipe from the floor. "If they come closer, I'll distract them." Tasha's wide eyes reflected fear and determination. Jeremy clutched the laptop tightly. In a burst of movement, Ebony hurled the pipe down the corridor past the officers, causing a loud clatter. Instinctively, Bigby and Hatfield whipped around. Ebony, Tasha and Jeremy sprinted in the opposite direction, heading for the side hallway. Shots rang out. The deafening cracks echoed in the cavernous factory. Bullets ricocheted off metal, sparks flying. Ebony's heart pounded as they ducked behind a rusted machine, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This way," Jeremy hissed, guiding them through a gap in the machinery that led to a back corridor. They ran, weaving through dark passageways, the smell of dust and decay thick in the air. The cops' footsteps thundered behind them. Ebony's lungs burned. Another shot rang out, shattering a nearby window. Glass rained down, slicing Ebony's arms with tiny cuts. They reached an emergency exit door. Jeremy shoved it hard, but it stuck. He rammed his shoulder against it again. It burst open, letting them spill out into the night air. Rain had started pouring, soaking them instantly. "Get to the car!" Tasha yelled. They dashed across the overgrown lot. Ebony could barely see through the sheets of rain. A bullet whizzed past her, lodging into the ground a few feet away. She stumbled but kept running. Finally they reached Tasha's sedan. Jeremy dived into the back seat, clutching the laptop. Ebony jumped into the front, Tasha behind the wheel. The car roared to life, headlights stabbing into the dark. A flash of white near the factory entrance. Ebony glimpsed Bigby's face contorted in rage, gun raised. Tasha floored the accelerator, tires screeching against wet asphalt. Another shot rang out, cracking the rear windshield. Shards of glass pelted the interior, but Tasha kept driving, the engine whining as the sedan sped away. The road was slick, the wipers struggling to clear the downpour. Ebony's pulse thundered in her ears. She cast a quick look at Jeremy in the back seat, who pressed the laptop protectively against his chest. Tasha inhaled a shaky breath, wincing at her own injuries, but her focus stayed locked on the road. They drove in tense silence for several miles. Finally, Ebony exhaled, letting out a trembling half-laugh, half-sob of relief. "We made it," she whispered, though she had no doubt Bigby and Hatfield would keep hunting them. For now, they had the evidence in hand, hopefully enough to destroy Wheeler's web of corruption once and for all. They knew staying in Oakwood was too dangerous. Hatfield and Bigby would likely broadcast an APB on them, claiming anything from resisting arrest to attempted murder. So they headed straight to Charleston, booking into a small hotel near the downtown area. The next morning, Ebony called a contact at the local NAACP office, explaining the situation. The organization vowed to help provide safe accommodations and reach out to federal authorities. In a cramped hotel room, Tasha plugged Jeremy's laptop into a secure drive. They combed through the files, bank statements, emails, phone call recordings. Every piece implicated Wheeler, Bigby, and Hatfield in a conspiracy to extort or frame suspects, especially those who threatened to blow the whistle on their corruption. Wheeler had reaped thousands in bribes for ensuring convictions and harsh sentences. Tasha's eyes were alight with fierce satisfaction. "We have enough to bring in the Department of Justice, Ebony. This is bigger than state level. We can reach out to the U.S. Attorney's Office." Ebony squeezed Tasha's uninjured hand. "Do it. Let's get the feds involved." A plan took shape. They would present the evidence to a federal prosecutor. Meanwhile, the NAACP would hold a press conference, with Ebony telling her story and unveiling the damning proof. This way, it would become national news, making it harder for Oakwood's corrupt network to bury. That evening, Ebony stood at the podium in the NAACP's modest conference room in Charleston. Cameras clicked, reporters scrawled notes. Tasha and Jeremy flanked her. She recounted her arrest, the planted evidence, and the near-fatal chase at the abandoned factory. Then she displayed printouts of Wheeler's suspicious bank transactions, reading out some of the incriminating text messages from Bigby to Wheeler. "I'm not the first they've framed," Ebony said, voice trembling with anger, "but I'm determined to be the last." She stepped away, letting Tasha detail the legal steps they were taking. Jeremy provided his testimony about finding the financial documents. The press, including a reporter from the Charleston Post and Courier, buzzed with excitement, sensing a huge scandal that could rock the entire region. By the time the press conference ended, Ebony felt a weight lifting. The truth was out in the open. Even if Bigby, Hatfield, and Wheeler tried to retaliate, the national spotlight might protect her. She just prayed it wasn't too late for justice. Within days, the story exploded across local and national media outlets. CNN picked it up, shining a bright light on Oakwood's pattern of questionable convictions. Civil rights groups demanded Wheeler's immediate suspension. Protests erupted outside the Oakwood Police Department, where citizens demanded the resignation of Bigby, Hatfield, and any other complicit officers. Behind the scenes, the wheels of justice turned. A federal grand jury convened to consider indictments against Bigby, Hatfield, Wheeler, and possible unknown co-conspirators. Evidence poured in from Jeremy's files, Wanda's text messages, and a string of victims stepping forward with stories of being framed. Tasha's phone rang day and night with calls from potential whistleblowers. Despite the swirl of fear and hope, Ebony found herself in a state of surreal calm. She'd risked everything to bring this corruption to light. If the system worked the way it was meant to, she'd be exonerated soon. Still, a small voice in her mind reminded her that power structures don't fall easily. She stayed on guard, moving from one safe place to another, never traveling alone. Then came the news. Judge Conrad Wheeler was arrested by federal agents at his home. Photos of him being led away in handcuffs dominated the evening news. Ebony watched from Tasha's living room, tears in her eyes. "They got him," Tasha said softly, turning up the volume. The anchor recapped the charges: conspiracy to commit bribery, obstruction of justice, money laundering. Bigby and Hatfield had been arrested that same morning, charged with civil rights violations, conspiracy, and more. The anchor went on to say the U.S. Attorney's Office had also uncovered evidence linking them to multiple fraudulent arrests, Ebony's being the most prominent. Tasha turned to Ebony with a grin. "It's over." Ebony swallowed a lump in her throat. "It's not over until I'm fully cleared, but..." She let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. It's close. Within hours, Ebony's lawyer received official notice. The charges against her were being dropped, effective immediately. Not only dropped, the U.S. attorney was looking into potential restitution for the harm caused by the false arrest. When Ebony heard the news, she collapsed onto the couch, tears of joy streaming down her face. Tasha laughed and cried with her, hugging her tight. They'd done it. They'd toppled one of the most insidious webs of corruption in Oakwood's recent history. And Ebony, the woman they tried to break, turned out to be the catalyst for their downfall. A week later, Ebony found herself in a new swirl of media attention, but this time for positive reasons. People kept asking the same question. Why did they pick you to frame? Of all the activists, why you? As Ebony told her story, it became clear that her unwavering activism, her ties to the NAACP, and her push for police oversight made her a prime target. But there was a deeper twist. After Ebony's exoneration, more details surfaced about her background. She had, in fact, come from a lineage of powerful civil rights advocates. Her late grandfather had marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and her father had served as a legal consultant for major civil rights cases. Ebony had always downplayed this heritage, wanting to forge her own path. But in the end, that very legacy gave her connections and resources she'd barely tapped into. Resources that made it possible to swiftly mobilize support from the national NAACP, from civil rights lawyers, and from the media. Once the local press uncovered Ebony's family background, the headlines morphed into a narrative of poetic justice. The granddaughter of a prominent civil rights activist takes down corrupt cops and a crooked judge. The story resonated nationwide, shining a stark light on racial injustice in modern policing. The day Ebony was officially cleared of all charges, she stood on the steps of the Oakwood courthouse, the same building where she'd been humiliated only weeks prior, and delivered a triumphant speech. Cameras flashed. The crowd cheered. "They tried to silence me with false charges," Ebony declared, voice strong. "They tried to bury me under the weight of a broken system, but all they did was water the seeds of truth. And now that truth has grown too big, too loud to be ignored any longer." A roar of applause followed, tears glittering in the eyes of those who had supported her. By her side stood Tasha, Wanda, Jeremy, members of the NAACP, and other community leaders. Together, they had proven that even the might of a corrupt system could be dismantled when people stood in solidarity. In the weeks that followed, the justice system made an example of those who abused its power. Judge Wheeler pleaded guilty in a federal plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial that would have exposed even more of his crimes. He received a hefty prison sentence, not the slap on the wrist some cynics expected. The gambling debts that had led him to accept bribes were overshadowed by the sheer cruelty of his actions. He lost his judgeship, his pension, and every last shred of respect he might have once had. Officers Bigby and Hatfield faced a reckoning of their own. With multiple victims testifying and an avalanche of damning evidence, they had no escape. They were charged with conspiracy, perjury, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. A jury convicted both men in a swift, decisive trial. Their sentences were harsh, and they went to federal prison. The media covered their downfall extensively, highlighting the hypocrisy of those sworn to protect the community. And the karma did not stop there. Investigations branched out, revealing more officers linked to lesser abuses of power. Some resigned under pressure, others were fired. The Oakwood Police Department underwent a massive overhaul. Pressured by lawsuits and protests, a federal oversight committee was introduced. Ironically, the same sort Ebony had been advocating for all along. In one final act of poetic justice, Ebony sued the city and won a substantial settlement. Instead of using it for personal gain, she invested the money into a new community legal clinic, providing pro bono representation for those wrongfully accused or unable to afford a lawyer. She named it the Mitchell Civil Rights Center in honor of her family's legacy. 6 months later, Ebony Mitchell stood in the brand-new offices of her community legal clinic. Sunlight streamed through large windows onto freshly painted walls. The hustle of staff and volunteers filled the air, phones ringing, footsteps in the hallway, the hum of copy machines. It was a bustling hive of hope. Ebony's reflection gazed back at her from a framed picture of her grandfather on the wall, taken during the 1965 Selma March. She felt a surge of pride. There was still so much work to do, but they had made a breakthrough. The seeds of accountability had been planted in Oakwood, and she was determined to watch them grow. Wanda Price sat at a nearby desk, smiling as she typed. She had taken a job as a community liaison, bridging the gap between law enforcement, the reformed portion of it, and the citizens they served. Tasha Cole was in a conference room down the hall, meeting with a team of young attorneys eager to make their mark on the world. Jeremy West was also on board, using his administrative skills to ensure the city's new oversight policies were followed to the letter. The past months had seen Ebony recognized nationwide for her courage. She'd appeared on talk shows, participated in panel discussions about police reform, and even contributed to a documentary by the Charleston Post and Courier, highlighting the city's journey from scandal to reform. Always she credited the countless people who had stood with her, who refused to let corruption stand. A knock on the doorframe made her turn. A young mother stepped in, eyes brimming with tears. "Mrs. Mitchell," she began, holding a stack of legal papers in trembling hands. "I need help. My son was arrested. They said he resisted an officer, but I swear he didn't." Ebony gave the woman a gentle smile, motioning her to sit. "We're here to listen," she said. "We'll do everything we can." As Ebony guided the woman to a chair, she felt the weight of her own journey. From the terrifying moment she was framed, to that final victory over the system that tried to crush her, everything had led to this point. She had chosen not to be consumed by vengeance or anger. Instead, she had forged a path that opened doors for others seeking justice. And that, in the end, was who Ebony Mitchell truly was. Not just a victim of a corrupt system, but a catalyst for change. The granddaughter of civil rights heroes and a hero in her own right. Her story became a testament that no matter how dark the road or how high the odds, truth has a way of emerging when courageous people band together. And sometimes the hardest struggles yield the sweetest, most resounding triumphs. In the end, the truth couldn't be silenced. The corrupt officers were arrested, the judge exposed, and the system that tried to destroy Ebony Mitchell was forced to answer for its crimes. But this wasn't just a victory for one woman. It was a message to everyone who had ever been wrongfully accused, silenced, or made to feel powerless. Ebony refused to be just another statistic. Instead, she became a force for justice, proving that when people stand together, even the most powerful corruption can crumble. But stories like this happen every day, and not everyone gets the chance to fight back. If you believe in justice, in exposing the truth, and in stories that make an impact, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. There's so much more to uncover, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Hit that subscribe button and let's keep shining a light on the truth.